Welcome friends, I hope you're doing very well. So as you know, I have watched three World War II movies now. So I watched Saving Private Ryan, The Hacksaw Ridge and A Bridge Too Far. So three different movies. I loved all of them. And after watching the three videos, my patrons over at Patreon suggested me to have a look at this YouTube channel who did this video about the fallen of the World War II. It's something that I have not seen before again, and I thought why not I watch it and share my thoughts and also bring you along with me while I watch it for the first time and let you know how I think about it as well. Because it seems like it's something popular that may some of you may have already seen it as well. So I just want to see what it is about. And I want to highlight to you during the video, I will pause it first out of respect to the creator because I want to hear what he is actually saying. I do not want to miss anything. And number two, because it is something like it's not a documentary, but it is something that where I can learn things. I want to learn and not talk over it and miss important things. So I will be pausing in between. And if I have to say things, and then I will continue. So this is just to let you know. So if you like a video like this, do not forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you have not subscribed to the channel, I hope you consider doing so as well. And you can find all my full-length reactions to my videos, my movies, over at Patreon, along with my full-length commentary as well. So without further ado, let's join to see The Fallen of World War II by Neil Halloran. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing the name incorrectly. I'm excited to watch this one.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years. And an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s, at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives were cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who are injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths, and we'll begin with American soldiers. Over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach.
Just want to pause here, like that depiction of D-Day in Saving Private Ryan was brilliantly done, really. I hope you had the opportunity to watch the movie, and if you have not watched my reaction video as well, because it was a brilliantly done movie. Wow. And that D-Day was, yeah, it wasn't good. And I wonder what I'm going to learn about the D-Day here. But so far, I'm actually liking this video because I have an analytics background myself. So I'm into data, the analytics side, obviously far from this, what he's talking about. But I love this kind of data analysis, and it just is so easy for you to grasp things. I wish actually in schools they teach a lot of things this way, because I think a lot of children will benefit from it.
Where 2,500 Americans fell.
2,500 Americans.
So about the same number of US soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan.
Whoa.
The bloodiest
Doesn't
battle in the
make you feel
Pacific
better, though.
was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died.
That is the Hacksaw Bridge, Okinawa.
About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides, but the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies. Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium. But most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front, Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
Oh my word.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers. But winning the war came at a cost.
Whoa. Whoa. It's really sad.
$8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
I'm just gonna pause there for a minute and just say, actually, that's the thing. When I watch the World War II movies, I watch the movies that involve the American side, the British and the Western side of it, actually. But looking at the Eastern Front, right, the amount they lost, it's insane. I did not think about the war this way, but with the information that we have, with the knowledge that we have of what went there, because the World War II for the Russia was the Great Patriot War, if I'm not mistaken, it was said. So they were willing to fight for Mother Russia, and they were sent in these numbers which Russia had at the time as well. It's just so heartbreaking. 8.7 million, and then when he said it could have been even up to 14 million, these are lives we are talking about. When you think about 400,000 odd American soldiers, how difficult it is to digest, because these are lives, right? And I mean, that's the funny thing. I was just thinking, so with the movies that I watched, the Saving Private Ryan, the Hacksaw Ridge, and the A Bridge Too Far, so in World War II, Russia was actually with allies with the rest of the Western countries when it came to the fighting the Nazi, and then this Russia splitting away from that whole situation, and then the Cold War happened with the communism, and which was after the World War II. So that whole situation. So I'm surprised actually. Russia has, at least for the movies that was proposed to me, suggested to me, was not included in that. Those kind of movies, they were not represented, but I actually look forward to watching movies from the Russian end as well. I just would like to see that, because it was equally and severely hard for them, the World War II. Looking at these numbers, it's not by any means it's difficult to digest, really difficult to digest. It's insane.
Of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this.
Whoa.
You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time. And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe. Six million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station.
I'm just going to pause because I'm sorry I'm interrupting here, but I want to share things and I want to learn more, so I do not want to interrupt what he's saying here. But I have read several books and watched a lot of documentaries as well about Auschwitz, and the books I've read are from the Auschwitz survivors, which is really heartbreaking, but at the same time assures you how hardy humans are actually. When there is, through the toughest and roughest of times, people do survive. That is the beauty of us, and that's why we as a race, we strive to thrive and then live, and then we will survive, right? But interestingly, I was thinking, because he just mentioned that Treblinka is the next biggest this the camps that they had. I actually have not read about it. Definitely have not read books or anything about it. I think I have seen some documentaries, but I don't think it is as popular, or at least I have not watched them. So it's good to learn. Maybe I should look up. And because Auschwitz is the thing, I feel like it's a lot more popular. I shouldn't be using this word like marketed, but that is what's there. Like all of us know about World War II, that what happened, all the crazy things that happened in Auschwitz. So it will be interesting. It will be heartbreaking, but as I always say, if the reality about human nature and history was brutal and it was ugly, if it is the reality, I'm still happy to learn it, because what's the purpose of us saying no, it did not happen, just because it's ugly or it's really difficult for us to digest? If it's the reality, that's what happened, then it happened, and it's good to learn what happened and learn from it what humans can be actually. Let's move on.
Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews. Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt. The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed. About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million. A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years. 1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million. Let's step back and see where we are with the totals.
Oh.
We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, It brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan.
Yeah.
On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty. China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis.
I remember that.
But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included.
Yes.
More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years. The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking. When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq, but rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all, and here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now bear in mind we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs, or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
First of all, friends, I just want to say what a brilliant video that was. That Neil Halloran is extremely talented. The data he presented, the way he presented it, how effective it is for someone to feel the depth of it. I mean, bringing emotions out with numbers, it's amazing. Extremely well done. I wish I was as talented as him. It was like brilliantly done. He deserves all the views that he's getting, or a lot more actually. It's amazing. Really, truly amazing. One thing I actually did not interrupt while the documentary was going on, while the video was going on, is at the end when he mentioned about this long pace. This is just my thought. Please feel free to disagree, obviously. I feel like the long peace actually happened, like he said, to be grateful to the Cold War and the invention of nuclear power. Because with the invention of the nuclear power, I think there is this, what we call MAD, mutual assured destruction, that is there, that especially the developed states do understand. So if one state is to proceed with the destruction, that you may receive in it similar reaction in return. So I think this MAD and the invention of nuclear power has expanded this long pace as well. Because looking at the numbers that he himself shared, and looking at the history of human nature, humans do tend to want to conquer, and it is innate in us to want to fight. And if you look at the history about Homo sapiens and before that as well, you can see these trends. So I feel like we have, like, in my opinion, I think it's a big playing factor for this long pace, and I really hope, yes, I pray this is what's going to last for centuries to come, hopefully. And I think the war, in a way, is now it's different. What we see is more of a financial and economical impact rather than a military war. But there are proxy wars, like he mentioned as well. But yes, when you look at the numbers, 70 million people lost, lives lost, and that again, I feel like may not represent the actual number, which may be well over the number that he highlighted. That, to think of it, for the country that I'm living in, it's almost like 13 times the population of the country. So it's crazy, right? It's insane to think how many lives are lost. It's really heartbreaking looking at the Soviet Union, the numbers from Russia. It's just, I mean, these are humans at the end of the day, right? Like, it did not make me feel any better looking at Germany, from the Nazi front, or the Germany as a whole, the numbers that were lost. It doesn't make you feel any better. If you hear the numbers that were lost, yes, all the atrocities that was committed and done by Japanese, and then looking at their numbers, does it make you feel any better? For me, it does not, because at the end of the day, I look at it as just another human. And when we watch the movies, like when I watched the Saving Private Ryan, Hacksaw Ridge, and then A Bridge Too Far, each and every soldier who's dying, doesn't matter which front they are coming from, their cry their prayer, their helplessness sounds the same. That is really heartbreaking. So I actually wanted to highlight this one because when I was watching, especially Saving Private Ryan, I mentioned the futility of war. I actually want to mention this. I think this video really highlights why I was mentioning it. It was not to mention that what these soldiers did and what they went through for wasn't for nothing. No way. It is not what I actually meant. The futility is what I meant by the lives that were lost, right? So you can see how many soldiers were lost, how soldiers' lives were lost, and then how many civilians died. I mean, that is where I see the futility of it. But yes, the war happened and it had to be fought, and whoever sacrificed their lives, yes, gave us this day today. But ideally, shouldn't have happened. But I'm not as immature to say like it could have been avoided or a war should not happen, because as long as humans are there, it can happen any day, as we can see. But anyway, I really love this video. I have never watched any of his videos. Like I said, I love the numbers, the analytics, and that's part of what my job is as well, and my real job is. So I really love what he did. Amazing. I wish our education system adopt things like this, because students will become a lot more invested, they will learn a lot more, and at the same time I think you can make a difference in children's life as well, because I think nowadays children may not learn about World War II and the history of it as much as we did. Even I didn't learn much in the school actually, apart from what I learned outside from school, from my own research and reading. So I think these kind of things really is important, because it is important to show where we come from, what has happened to us, our previous generations, what sacrifices have been done, and what actually people can do to each other as well. So I think it's really important. Brilliant channel, brilliant one. I think I'm gonna, again, after this video, gonna check it out a bit, because I can learn a lot from there. Anyway, thank you so much to all my patrons at our Patreon for suggesting this video, and thank you so much to all of you here for watching this video. If you have already watched this one, do let me know how did you find it as well. And if you have not had the opportunity to watch my World War II movie reactions, I hope you take time to do that. So the links to the videos will be in the comment and the description below as well of this video. So thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a lovely day wherever you are, and I hope to see you very soon with another movie reaction. So take care.